The sound of enemy footsteps echoed through the dense jungle, and the heartbeats of two American pilots captured after their plane was shot down drummed in their ears. As they were dragged through the woods by the Japanese soldiers, terror gripped them. They had been trained to expect torture, to expect brutality. Propaganda had promised them that if they were caught, their lives would be filled with agony, with unimaginable pain. But as they were brought into a small, isolated Japanese village, something happened that none of them could have predicted. Instead of cruelty, they were met with something far more terrifying: kindness. It was a hot afternoon in 1942, somewhere deep in the Pacific Theater. After a fierce aerial battle, two American pilots parachuted out of their damaged aircraft, landing in enemy territory. The pilots, dressed in flight gear and covered in dust, found themselves surrounded by Japanese soldiers. Their hearts raced, every fiber of their being expecting to feel the sting of bullets, the pain of a bayonet, or the harsh commands of their captors. The American pilots had heard the rumors, the stories about how enemy soldiers were treated: brutal interrogations, beatings, executions. But as they were escorted through the dense forest towards a small village, something extraordinary happened. The very enemy they feared began to treat them differently. What they had been taught about their captors was beginning to unravel before their eyes. The sky above them was a bruised blue, the aftermath of a violent battle. As the two American pilots, Lieutenant John Matthews and Sergeant William Harris, tumbled out of their crippled bomber, they felt a deep chill in the pit of their stomachs. The wind whipped around them as their parachutes snapped open, and the world below seemed to rush upward, the green and brown landscapes of the Pacific blending into a blur. The intense feeling of fear surged as their bodies floated downward, the ground coming closer with every passing second. The two men had only a few minutes to process what had happened. Their plane, a heavy bomber, had been shot down by enemy fighters. They had been on a reconnaissance mission deep within enemy lines, and now, with the canopy of their parachutes fluttering in the breeze, they were helpless. There was no way to communicate with their comrades, no way to fight back. They were alone, stranded in hostile territory. As they landed, the ground seemed to swallow them up. The dense jungle was thick with the scent. The following days felt like an eternity for Captain James, as he lay hidden in the dense jungle waiting for a rescue that seemed less and less likely. His clothes were tattered, his body weak, and his mind was clouded by fear. The jungle, once a place of life and vitality, now felt like a suffocating trap. Each rustling leaf made his heart race. Each bird call sounded like an approaching enemy patrol. But amidst this seemingly endless despair, there came a faint hope in the form of an unexpected encounter. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the dense foliage, James heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the soft crunch of footsteps, barely audible yet unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat, thinking it was a Japanese patrol closing in on him. But then something unexpected happened. The footsteps stopped and a figure emerged from the shadows. To James's astonishment, it wasn't a soldier. It was a civilian, a woman. She looked to be in her late 40s, wearing a simple, faded kimono. Her face was weathered from years of hard work under the harsh tropical sun, but her eyes held an unmistakable warmth and kindness. She was alone, a solitary figure amidst the wilderness. James couldn't believe it. The woman, noticing his shock, didn't seem surprised to find a foreign soldier in her village. She only hesitated for a brief moment before speaking softly in broken English. "You American?" she asked, her voice trembling but calm. James could hardly find the words. His throat was dry and he felt a rush of emotions flood his chest. He nodded slowly. "I am," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. The woman looked at him, and in her eyes he saw no malice, no hatred, just curiosity and concern. "I help you," she said simply, and without waiting for any reply, she reached into the small bag slung across her shoulder. She pulled out a bundle of rice wrapped in a banana leaf and handed it to James. The simplicity of the gesture hit him like a wave of emotion. He had been surviving on the smallest scraps of food, barely enough to keep him going, and now this woman, a stranger, was offering him a small feast. Without a second thought, "Eat," she said again, her voice gentle but firm, as if she was offering something far more precious than food. James took the rice from her, his hands trembling. He had been taught to fear these people, to think of them as enemies, monsters who would torture and kill him if they had the chance. But here was this woman, offering him food, risking her own life to help him. Before he could say anything, she turned and motioned for him to follow. The woman led James through the jungle, down hidden paths that he had never noticed before. She moved with ease as though the jungle was her second home. The further they went, the more surreal the situation seemed. James had been taught to view the Japanese as cruel, ruthless, and unfeeling. But this woman, risking everything to help him, was proving him wrong. They reached a small village hidden deep in the jungle, its modest houses built from bamboo and palm leaves. The villagers were all busy with their daily tasks, but when they saw the woman return with James, they stopped everything. The men and women, young and old, gathered around, their eyes wide with surprise and curiosity. James, feeling uncomfortable under the intense scrutiny of the villagers, instinctively took a step back. But the woman, whom he had come to trust in these short hours, smiled and gestured for him to sit. She motioned for a young girl to bring him more food, and without hesitation, the villagers resumed their work. They didn't speak much, but their eyes told a different story, one of empathy, one that James could never have imagined in a million years. As James sat there, eating and regaining his strength, he began to notice the subtle interactions between the villagers. They were calm and composed, yet there was an air of unspoken solidarity among them. They knew what was at stake. They knew that if the Japanese military discovered their actions, they would be executed without mercy. Yet despite this constant threat, they were willing to risk everything to help a foreign soldier, a man from the enemy side, survive. James couldn't understand it at first. How could they do this? How could they risk their lives to help someone who had come to their land as an enemy? But as he spent more time in the village, he started to see things differently. These people were not the brutal, cold-hearted enemies he had been told about. They were just people who had been caught in the same web of war, and yet, despite everything, they had not lost their humanity. For the first time in months, James felt a glimmer of hope. The kindness of these villagers gave him something he thought was lost forever, a reason to keep fighting, a reason to survive. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows over the devastated landscape. The battlefield was eerily silent, save for the distant rumble of artillery fire. Klaus, still in disbelief from the events that had just unfolded, sat huddled on the cold, unforgiving ground. His hands trembled, not from the fear of the enemy, but from the overwhelming confusion that had taken hold of him. He had been told for years that the Americans, the enemy, were nothing more than ruthless barbarians without honor or humanity. The propaganda he had been fed since childhood had painted them as savages, intent on destroying everything they held dear. And yet here he was, sitting in the dirt, with nothing but an empty canteen in front of him, surrounded by soldiers who had done nothing but show kindness. For the first time in his young life, Klaus didn't know what to think. He had expected the worst. He had anticipated torture. He had even been prepared to die. But this act of mercy was beyond anything he could comprehend. The black American soldier, the one who had given him water, still stood nearby, watching him intently. His eyes were filled with an expression Klaus couldn't quite decipher. Sympathy? Pity? No, it wasn't that. There was something else, something that felt like understanding. "Trinken," the soldier had said softly. "Drink." The water had tasted sweet, not just because of the relief it brought to his parched throat, but because of what it represented. In that moment it felt as if the harshness of the war, the years of indoctrination, and the fear of the unknown had all been washed away. Even if just for a fleeting moment, the soldier, who had once been painted as an enemy to be feared, now seemed like a human being, a man who understood the suffering Klaus had endured. Klaus felt a small shift within him. The walls he had built around himself, walls constructed from years of hatred, propaganda, and fear, began to feel a little weaker. The truth of what was happening, the truth that his captors were showing him compassion, was something that threatened to shatter everything he had ever been taught. But Klaus wasn't ready to accept it all yet. Not fully. The years of indoctrination ran deep. His mind fought against what his heart was beginning to believe. After all, how could this be real? How could the very people he had been taught to hate, people he had been told would kill him without a second thought, be offering him food, water, and safety? He had expected cruelty, but here he was being treated with more kindness than he had ever known. And with each passing second, the foundation of everything he had believed started to crumble. Still, the shadow of doubt loomed. Klaus stared at the American soldier who had given him water. He wanted to speak, to ask why, but the words wouldn't come. His tongue felt heavy in his mouth, as if the reality he was facing was too much for him to express. "Why aren't you going to kill me?" Klaus finally managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Why are you being kind?" The soldier looked down at him, the faintest smile on his face. "We're not monsters, kid," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're just men like you. We fight because we have to, but we don't hate you." Klaus was stunned. The soldier's words were like a balm to the wound in his soul, soothing the fears he had carried for so long. They didn't hate him. They didn't see him as an enemy. They saw him as a human being, just like themselves. But the realization was a double-edged sword. On one hand, Klaus felt relief, a sense of hope beginning to sprout in his heart, but on the other hand, he was terrified. What did this mean for everything he had ever believed? If the Americans weren't the monsters he had been taught to fear, then what did that make the people who had raised him? The Führer, the Nazi regime, the whole ideology he had grown up with? It all seemed like a lie that had sent him to the brink of death, a lie that had stolen his innocence. For the first time in his life, Klaus was forced to confront the possibility that everything he had ever been taught about the war, about his enemies, about his own place in the world was wrong. The realization was devastating. It felt like his whole world was crumbling. As the days passed in the camp, Klaus's mind began to drift in a sea of contradictions. Everything he had known, everything he had been taught since childhood was being slowly, painfully dismantled. The war that had consumed him for so long seemed to have ended not with the decisive, heroic final blow he had imagined, but with mercy. The very mercy he had been told did not exist in the hearts of his enemies. Klaus had grown up in a world where the enemy was never to be trusted. They were monsters, savage and ruthless, devoid of the basic decency that made humans human. But the Americans had shattered that illusion. They had shown him compassion, a compassion he hadn't even known existed within the confines of war. One afternoon, as Klaus sat with the other prisoners, something changed within him. The wall that had existed between him and the American soldiers, the soldiers who had been painted as heartless killers, began to crack. He had already experienced their kindness in small doses, the offer of water, the shared rations, the gentle way they had treated him, but now the weight of that kindness was pressing down on him. His emotions, once so carefully controlled by years of propaganda, began to spill out. He had been taught to hate these men, to see them as monsters. But here they were offering him food, water, and even conversations. It was not just kindness. It was humanity. Klaus sat up straighter, his eyes scanning the camp. The soldiers were busy at their posts, doing their jobs as though nothing extraordinary had happened. To them, this was just another part of their duty. But to Klaus, this was the beginning of something much more profound. His world was slowly crumbling, not because of gunfire or bombs, but because of an unexpected act of mercy. And that mercy was forcing him to reevaluate everything. The days in the camp were quiet, almost surreal. The other prisoners, many of them young like Klaus, began to open up, speaking to the American soldiers as if they were fellow humans, not enemies. They had seen the Americans as monsters for so long, but now they saw them as men. They spoke of their families, their homes, their lives before the war. Klaus listened, absorbing everything. The soldiers were just like him. They had been caught in the same destructive machine of war, but unlike him, they had not been molded by hatred. They had not been raised to believe that mercy was weakness. Klaus thought about his own upbringing, about how he had been taught to see the world in black and white, to follow orders without question, to believe that the enemy was always wrong. He had been raised to believe that his life was nothing but a tool to serve the Führer and the Nazi regime. He had been told that sacrifice was noble, that death for the Reich was the ultimate honor. But now, as he sat in the camp, surrounded by soldiers who had once been his enemies, he realized how much of that had been a lie. The shift in Klaus's mind was slow, but undeniable. His hatred for the Americans, which had been so deep-rooted and unwavering, began to dissolve. What was left was confusion, yes, but also a new sense of clarity. The lies he had been fed about the enemy, about the world, were falling apart piece by piece. The Nazis had painted the Americans as monsters, but the truth was far more complicated. The truth was that they were men just like Klaus, who had been forced into a war they didn't want. The more Klaus thought about it, the more he realized that the real monsters were the ones who had sent him to fight, who had sent him to die for a cause that was built on lies and hate. The Führer, the regime, the very ideology he had fought for, it was all a sham. The Americans had shown him what it meant to be human, what it meant to treat others with dignity regardless of their nationality. Klaus couldn't understand it all at once. How could he? The propaganda had shaped his entire worldview. But day by day, as the Americans showed him more kindness, as the soldiers treated him with respect and care, Klaus began to see the world through a new lens. He began to see that the Americans weren't his enemies. They were people who had been caught in the same brutal cycle of war, and they were trying to find their way out of it just like him. One evening, as Klaus was sitting near the campfire with some of the other prisoners, an American soldier approached him. Klaus had seen this soldier before. He had been one of the ones who had shown him kindness when he first arrived. The soldier sat down beside him, his face relaxed and calm, as if the world had not just been turned upside down. "How are you holding up?" the soldier asked, his voice soft but sincere. Klaus looked at him, unsure how to respond. He wanted to tell the soldier everything, that he was scared, that he didn't know what to think, that his entire life had been a lie. But the words, as Klaus Becker sat in the camp, a quiet weight began to settle on his chest. Not from the physical exhaustion of war, but from something far more complex. The American soldiers had treated him with kindness, something he had never believed possible. As the days passed, he found himself struggling with the realization that everything he had been taught about the enemy was wrong. The sheer scale of betrayal was overwhelming. He had spent his childhood being told that Americans were monsters, that they would torture and kill him without hesitation. Yet here he was, alive, well-fed, and treated with humanity. The camp was far from comfortable, but Klaus had come to see it in a new light. Where there should have been cruelty, there was nothing but routine. Guards watched over them, yes, but they did so with no more hostility than a schoolteacher overseeing children. The food was simple but plentiful. They had clean clothes. The medical care was better than anything Klaus had ever experienced in Germany, and the soldiers, even those who had fought against him, were concerned for his well-being. One evening, as the sun set over the camp, Klaus found himself sitting by a fire with a group of other prisoners. The crackling of the flames seemed to mimic the rapid thoughts in his head, thoughts he couldn't quite express. He turned to Friedrich, the boy who had fought beside him in the final days of the war. "I don't understand," Klaus said, his voice thick with confusion. "Everything we were told, it's all a lie." Friedrich looked at him, his face tired, but there was understanding in his eyes. "I know, Klaus. I thought the same thing when I first got here. They said the Americans would kill us, but they didn't." Klaus leaned back, staring at the fire, his mind reeling. He had spent so long believing in a lie, believing that surrender meant death, that Americans were barbarians. But now he was being treated with respect, not as an enemy, but as a person. A boy who had been caught up in a war he didn't choose. The soldiers here didn't see him as a monster. They saw him as a frightened child. The more he interacted with the American soldiers, the more his worldview crumbled. They didn't treat him as the enemy. They treated him like a fellow human being. The constant fear that had gripped him for years began to fade. It wasn't an immediate transformation. It wasn't like flipping a switch. But day by day, Klaus found himself thinking less about the uniform he wore and more about the people around him, their faces, their actions, their words. One afternoon, Klaus found himself talking to an American medic named James. James was just a few years older than Klaus and, in many ways, seemed no different from him. He had the same tired eyes, the same exhaustion etched into his face. But unlike Klaus, James had been raised in a world where he was taught to help others, to heal, not to fight. "How do you do it?" Klaus asked James, the question escaping before he could stop it. James looked at him, confused. "Do what?" "Fight in this war. Do you ever wonder why you're here? Why we're fighting?" Klaus's voice trembled slightly. "I don't understand. We were told we were fighting for something righteous, but now I don't know." James paused for a moment, looking into Klaus's eyes. "It's hard to explain, kid. The thing is, I don't want to fight. I don't want to kill anyone. But sometimes that's just the way things go. It's war and we're all caught up in it. But I'd rather help you than hurt you." Klaus stared at him, the weight of James's words sinking in. "You're not like what we were taught," Klaus whispered. "You're not monsters." James smiled softly, the first real smile Klaus had seen in weeks. "No, kid. We're just people, trying to make it through." For the first time in months, Klaus felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt before. Hope. Hope that maybe the world wasn't as dark as he had been taught to believe. Hope that there was something beyond the war. Something worth fighting for, but not in the way he had been trained. The days that followed were marked by small moments of understanding, of connection. Klaus spoke to more of the American soldiers, and with each conversation his feelings shifted. The walls that had been built around his heart began to crack, and for the first time he started to see the soldiers as individuals, not as the faceless enemy. They were not monsters. They were human beings, just like him, caught in the madness of war. One evening, Klaus found himself sitting in the mess hall, eating a simple meal of soup and bread. He looked around at the other prisoners, boys his age, boys who had fought alongside him, and boys who had been taught the same lies. But as Klaus ate, he realized something that he had never thought possible. He was starting to see them, not as soldiers, but as young men who had been caught in a war that was never theirs to fight. They were victims just like him. The propaganda he had been fed for so long had taught him to hate, to fear. But now, with each passing day, Klaus realized that those lies had only served to blind him to the truth, that the real enemy was not the Americans, but the war itself. The war that had stolen his childhood, his innocence, and the lives of countless others. The more Klaus thought about it, the more he realized that his survival wasn't just about living through the war. As Klaus sat in the camp, he couldn't help but reflect on the transformation he had undergone in just a few short weeks. His time in captivity had forced him to confront the lies he had lived with for so long. And now, as he sat among the American soldiers, he began to see them not as enemies, but as human beings. The relationships he was building with the soldiers were slow, fragile at first. Klaus wasn't sure how to navigate these new bonds. For years, he had been taught that kindness from the enemy was impossible. But as the days went by, he found himself talking more and more with the soldiers, learning about their lives, their families, and their experiences. They weren't so different from him after all. One soldier in particular, Sergeant William Hayes, took a special interest in Klaus. William would often sit with him after a long day's work, sharing stories of his own life back home in the United States. Klaus found comfort in these moments, a quiet reassurance that not all soldiers were here to destroy. They were in many ways as lost in this war as he had been. Klaus learned that William had a family, a wife and children he longed to return to. They talked about the differences in their countries, the things they had in common, and what life would be like after the war ended. It was during one of these talks that Klaus realized he wasn't just talking to a soldier anymore. He was talking to a person, someone with hopes and dreams. By opening up to William, Klaus began to rebuild his trust in people. He saw the human side of the soldiers, their compassion and vulnerability. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about connecting with others, forging relationships that transcended war. In that quiet camp amidst all the horrors of the past, Klaus began to understand that peace was something built on empathy, understanding, and trust. The days in the camp blended together, marked only by the small acts of kindness that kept Klaus going. It wasn't the large gestures that moved him most, but the simple, everyday moments of compassion. The soldiers continued to treat him and the other prisoners with respect, offering food, water, and most importantly, a glimpse of what it meant to be human. It was during one of the many mundane moments, sitting in the mess hall with a cup of coffee, that Klaus had a quiet epiphany. For so long he had felt like a soldier, like a cog in the machine of war. His only purpose had been to fight, to obey, to follow orders. But now, in this strange new world, he was starting to realize something important. His worth was not defined by the uniform he wore or the battles he fought. His worth was defined by his humanity, by the choices he made. As the war came to an end, Klaus began to look forward to the future, something he hadn't dared to imagine in years. He thought about the life he could have once the war was truly over. He thought about the possibility of education, of rebuilding his family's life in a world where the fighting was finished. He wasn't sure what life would look like after the war. But for the first time, Klaus felt a glimmer of hope. He had survived, not just physically but emotionally. The mercy he had received from the soldiers, especially the kindness of Sergeant Hayes, had taught him that there was life beyond the battlefield. A life where people could coexist, where enemies could become friends, and where compassion outweighed hatred. Klaus now carried that hope with him, something he had never thought possible before. It wasn't just the end of the war that filled him with hope. It was the possibility of redemption, of healing, and of peace. The day the war officially ended was a bittersweet moment for Klaus. The world around him had been forever changed, and he was no longer the same boy who had first arrived at the American camp. The young soldier who had once been so sure of his cause, so ready to die for his country, now saw the world through a different lens. When Klaus returned to Germany, the country he once called home was unrecognizable. Berlin was in ruins, its streets torn apart by the devastation of war. His family's home was reduced to rubble, and the people he had once known were scattered, many of them gone forever. Yet, despite the brokenness of his surroundings, Klaus knew that something within him had been restored. In the months following the war's end, Klaus worked alongside his mother to rebuild their lives. The emotional scars of war would never completely fade, but he had learned that survival was not just about physical endurance. It was about rebuilding the soul, finding peace in a fractured world. Klaus's experience in the American camp had changed him irrevocably. The compassion he had received from soldiers like Sergeant Hayes became the foundation for the new life he was building. He learned to forgive, not just the soldiers who had fought against. Klaus's life after the war was not without challenges. He struggled to adapt to a world that had been irrevocably altered by the conflict. The emotional trauma he carried with him was a heavy burden, and the scars of war were not easily healed. Yet, despite the darkness of the past, Klaus found solace in the memories of the kindness he had received during his captivity. As he grew older, Klaus became more and more determined to share his story, to spread the message of mercy he had learned in the most unlikely of places. He became a teacher, not of history, but of compassion. He spoke to his students about the importance of seeing the humanity in others, of rejecting the hatred and fear that had fueled the war. Klaus's story became a testament to the power of mercy. He often spoke of the soldiers who had shown him kindness when he had expected death. He spoke of Sergeant Hayes, the American medic who had treated him with respect and compassion. And he spoke of the moment when he realized that the true enemy wasn't the soldiers he had fought against, but the lies that had shaped his life. Through his teachings, Klaus inspired a new generation to embrace the values of mercy, empathy, and forgiveness. His story served as a powerful reminder that even in the dark, as Klaus aged, his story continued to resonate with those who heard it. He had become a symbol of the power of mercy to heal even the deepest wounds, and when he passed away in 1993, his story lived on in the hearts of those who had been touched by his words and his example. In the years after Klaus's death, his students carried his message forward. They taught their own children about the lessons of kindness, mercy, and the importance of seeing beyond the labels that divided people. Klaus's legacy was not one of war or destruction, but of peace and understanding. Klaus Becker, the boy who had been trained to hate, became a man who dedicated his life to teaching others that mercy could triumph over hatred. His story continued to inspire people around the world, showing that even in the face of war, humanity could endure. The lessons he learned from the American soldiers during his time in captivity shaped not only his life, but the lives of countless others. And in that, Klaus's legacy lived on, a testament to the power of mercy and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Klaus Becker's journey from a young, indoctrinated soldier to a man of peace and understanding is a testament to the transformative power of mercy. Through the unexpected kindness shown to him by American soldiers during his capture, Klaus's worldview was shattered, and the lies he had been taught about his enemies collapsed. What began as a story of fear, if Klaus's story has inspired you to rethink the power of mercy and understanding in your own life, share this message of hope with others. In a world where division often feels insurmountable, we have the power to bridge the gaps through kindness, empathy, and compassion. Let's be the change we wish to see. Consider supporting organizations dedicated to spreading peace, understanding, and reconciliation, or start by having a conversation in your community about the importance of empathy over animosity. Share this story with your friends, family, or on social media, and remind everyone that humanity is stronger than hate. Together, we can honor Klaus Becker's legacy by embracing the power of mercy in our own lives. Let's build a world where compassion leads the way.